John Paul II in his prophetic teachings about the dignity of the human person. I've had occasion to put it in writing that he is the Pope of the dignity of man, and this because he was first the Pope of the sovereignty of God. The two are inseparably connected. And I think if we look in retrospect, maybe another generation or two will appreciate an incredible contribution of John Paul II towards the understanding of human dignity, especially at a historical time when it is most under attack and most violated. I think nobody will dispute that point. Even those who are in the opposed camp to us will have to concede that the fate of the human person is really in a critical time. What does prophecy mean? It means many things. Among other things, it means to witness to the truth, not necessarily to prophesy the future. But if you focus on the truth, which is eternal, you're also talking about the future. And at a time of crisis, witness the truth is also a warning. Again, we certainly are in a time of crisis. John Paul is very much aware of that. And he says in one of his encyclicals, who can deny that our age is one marked by a profound crisis of truth, which first means a crisis of concepts. He goes on to ask, does the word love, freedom, sincere gift, and even person and rights of the person really convey their essential meaning? And this is in the letter to families. And the letter to families, in my reading, is a beautiful culmination and climax of a series of teachings that begins in the very beginning. And incidentally, he begins himself with the beginning, in which he focuses on the concept of the gift. And if you read that letter attentively, it's not that the word is only mentioned, the word is a key to the understanding of what later on he will tell us is a new criterion for understanding of creation, and that is what he calls the hermeneutics of a gift. And he says this in one of his audiences in 1980, I quote, he speaks of a new dimension, a new criterion of understanding and interpretation, which we will call the hermeneutics of the gift. The dimension of the gift decides the essential depth and meaning of original solitude, unity, and nakedness. And this is the cycle of talks where he's talking about the nuptial character of the body. It is also at the heart of the mystery of creation. So we have here a concept, a word that is used almost in everyday language. However, in the hands of John Paul II, it acquires a technical, metaphysical meaning. Right? For those of you who remember your college years, metaphysics was this arcane study of being as being. Well, in this case, it's the question of the being of the human person. With this concept of gift, he comes to the defense of that dignity which is under attack and so systematically violated. And as we shall see tonight, for him, the characteristic of being a gift belongs to the essence of the human person. Right? This is a far cry from that traditional term that we're used to, namely man is a rational animal. He is that, certainly. But we're taking a step deeper into that mystery of the created person when we recognize that the human person is a gift. Right? We can, if we have the time, I have a tremendous amount of material, and I was trying to decide what to leave in and what leave out, and I thought I'd take the very simple expedient of watching when your eyes glaze over, I leave it out. Okay, we can talk about anthropology, namely the self, in less technical terms. We can talk about community, that means the other. And then we'll talk about theology. And ultimately, I want to indicate tonight, and this is not going to be a surprise for you, that to do any kind of anthropology or any kind of study of community, it has to be a theological anthropology and a theological community, a theology of the community. And this reflects something of what the Holy Father says in the Faith and Reason. He doesn't start with reason, which is normally understood as the presupposition of faith. he starts the first chapter with faith. In other words, he's telling us we Catholics have a truth which is the only basis for renewing our understanding of what can be known without the help of faith. In other words, here, faith is the priority impetus for our going back to the natural foundations, which should be accessible to everybody, and doing it in such a way as to bring those who do not have the faith to begin to see what Christ offers by way of truth and understanding. In general, I'm not going to pause too long on that. We have a widespread depersonalization of the human person. One speaks of human existence as a fact, and this you find among philosophers. I don't know how many of you have had in your college days, remember the name Martin Heidegger. A very important figure, because I would say, just simply a rough guesstimate, the vast majority of our Catholic philosophers and theologians have fallen under the spell of the German mystic, I call him the mystifier, Martin Heidegger. Right? He speaks of human existence as a brute fact. Now, there's a certain truth. There is the fact of our existence, but we're more than simply a fact. One speaks of man as an effect or a product. And if you look at our textbooks in grammar schools and high school, man is the product of evolution. Man is the product of society. He's the product of culture, of circumstances, and so on. And ultimately, if everybody can produce man, why not man? Henceforth, man will be his own product. We will create the new man for the 21st century. Okay, so again, we are, in a sense, the effects of what? Of the causal activity of God. God is creator. He brought us into existence, and in that sense, we're an effect of his divine omnipotence. God is creator. But with John Paul II, we have to take a step beyond this and explicitly recognize what has always been there in the Catholic tradition, that God is creator and Father. In saying Father, we're saying more than creator. And this is why the feminists reject the category of fatherhood. They're willing to accept God as creator, but not as father. Why? Because it somehow involves this mystery of the gift, which we're going to try to unravel, or at least enter into, because we're not going to unravel it to the depth. We have to say something more about the human person. The person is given his existence. Oh, sure, we understand that. Do we? The word given, the word gift, is a normal word. It doesn't take a degree in atomic physics to understand that gift means something, and we understand what it means. But we don't make too much of it. And I think one of the things that we have to recognize, and perhaps this is a theme for the International Institute for Culture, what is the role of a gift in our public culture? We take things for granted, which is not the same thing as receiving them in gratitude. So I think one of the things that we're certainly trying to do in our college is bring the students to the appreciation of the fact that every scientist knows and should know that the world is a datum. And as John Paul says in one of his encyclicals, again, one of his audiences, the datum becomes the donum. The data are the things that are given. And the things that are given to us are gifts. And this is a metaphysical category. This is not poetry. This is not simply wishful thinking. A little background on Karol Wojtyła, and this is in a little book, dialogue or discussions about John Paul II. It's in Polish, and it's written by Tadeusz Styczyn, one of the men who's very close to the Holy Father. He was his disciple and then successor in the chair of ethics in Lublin. And he wrote it together with Ballawejder, and there they tell us that during his Lublin years, the young priest discovered the paradox of the contingency of human existence. Now, the contingency of human existence means what? That man is contingent upon, depends on whom? God the Creator. But he went more than that. He says the paradox consists of something that led him to a metaphysics of the person as gift. So we have a genuine metaphysical category. It's a new step in depth to recognize that the person as being is gift. Also on another, I don't remember this, I apologize for it, because when I was reading it, I was not getting ready to do a paper here. And this was about 1980, 81, somebody gave me a little book, and it was the sermons, it was in Polish, I read it, and there, it's Karol Wojtyła. They said, this is the Pope. I read it, and there I come across a sermon on fatherhood. And in it, he says, before I learn how to be the father, of the father of men, of very many men. Right? Isn't this a little prophetic, the Spirit speaking? As he was a priest then. I must first learn how to be a child. That's an interesting statement, isn't it? Before I learn to be the father of men, of very many men, I must first learn how to be a child. And then he goes on, and he says the basic word of the modern age is mine, whereas the basic word of the child is thine, spoken to the Father. Right? With a few words, with a few gestures, he sketches what is a fundamental truth that I think we need to recognize today, and gives us a key to understanding also the modern age. The modern age says mine, my body, my life, my decision. Right? And this is echoed in different ways, as we'll see later on, in our culture. Whereas the single basic word spoken by Christ is the liturgical word, thine, which he spoke on the cross. Right? The word of the child, the son, the firstborn of the Father is thine. Into thy hands I commit my spirit. This is Karol Wojtyła. John Paul II speaks of the definition of man given by the Second Vatican Council. That man cannot, and this is the famous Gaudium in Spes, number 24, that appears in every one of his major encyclicals and many of his talks and allocutions. Man cannot fully discover himself except through a sincere gift of self. Cannot discover himself, cannot find himself, cannot come into possession of himself, cannot actualize himself. Any one of these terms now can intimate the fundamental reality at stake. We do not become our own, in other words, until we give ourselves away. And that's the paradox of the contingency of human existence. We're not simply dependent on God, we are called to give ourselves away. And then he goes on to say, without such a concept of man, of the person, and of the communion of persons, there can be no civilization of love. All right? So the context now is the critical situation, the crisis of the human condition, the attack on the dignity of the human person. We need a concept of the person, or of man, that focuses on his gift character. Without this, we cannot have a civilization of love. And that means we also have here a key for understanding the culture of death, do we not? Okay, so let's look at this as we go on. Okay, the first step will very briefly, and what I have sketched here is subject matter for a whole semester's course, okay? The nature or the essence of the gift. And I'll mention about 7 or 8 points. I'll try to go quickly. I forgot what time we started, but I must keep in mind that all good things must come to an end. We started at what, at 8 o'clock? 1:45? Already? You started at 1:45. I started later. Okay, in any case, when your eyes glaze over, I'll take that as a sign for me to start. Okay, imagine you're sitting there and all of a sudden through the air comes flying an object and hits you on the head. And you say, ouch. I say, no, you should have said thank you. And you say, well, why? And I said, that's a gift. Am I correct? It may have been a gift, but a gift is not something that is thrown at you. It has to be offered to you. Why? So that you have a chance to accept or receive it. Okay? It's a distinct act. You are not passive. The gift is not at the same time something that you appropriate or take. There is a unique personal activity of receiving. The Holy Father will often use the word accepting interchangeably with receiving. But what he's trying to do is point to something fundamental here. I, as a person, have a very important role to play in this occurrence of the gift situation. Okay, so it's not something that is thrown at you. You're not passive, nor are you creative. If I walk down and pick up that nice little coat and give it to the lady over here and I say, here's a gift for you, you would say, but you can't give it to me. Why not? Nemo dat quod non habet is the Latin phrase. You can't give what you don't have. So I can't say, but wait a minute, I have it. No, you appropriated, you stole it, you took it, you extorted it, whatever the word is, you did not own that. Okay, so therefore the gift does not occur to a creative act of my own. Later on we can develop this. If we do that, say we cannot initiate the gift situation. Right? Basically the words of St. John here hold true, for he loved us first. We can never take the initiative, and this applies also to the gift situation. Right? So receiving, hold on to that word, is a very important concept. Receiving is a basic act of the person in this context of the gift. And secondly, well, thirdly now, well, this fourth point now, a lot of points in here, but we're putting them all together. If I give you that box now, kindly, you receive it, and you say, oh, for me, and I say, for you, you unwrap it, and out of it jump two poisonous serpents, and with your dying breath, you say, thank you. No, I mean, why? Because you intuitively know, again, this doesn't take a college education, that for something to be a gift, it has to be an objective good. Not simply something that pleases you or satisfies you. It has to be an objective good in itself, okay? So that's another point. We want to keep that in mind. Why? Because again, this is something that our culture has completely rejected, the notion of an intrinsic or an objective good. But let's take a step further. Assume here you are, you're a co-ed on the campus over here, is it St. Joseph? Right? A good Catholic girl, and this guy comes up to you and you say, oh, you again? He says, yes, here's a daisy. It's a gift for you. Now, this is a guy who's been pestering you for the last 5 years, and you don't want to have anything to do with him. Will you accept that daisy? Okay, he says, here's $1 million. Go, you can give it to the International Institute for Culture. Would you accept that gift? You would? No. You're sitting to that next to that good-looking gentleman, and you want to say you would accept that gift. No, because any woman that has a sense of her own dignity and honor will not accept a gift from a guy that she doesn't want to have anything to do with. Why? Because when you accept the gift, you accept the giver. Now, am I telling you the answers? No. See, this is the genius of Socrates, which I'm trying to imitate poorly. See, I'm not telling you the answers. You see these things. And we simply formulated that the giver is contained in the gift. Another way of saying that is the giver, in giving a gift, gives himself. So now we stand before, we have to go back a step and say, in receiving, I receive not only the gift, I receive the giver. And what else? If he gave a good, he gave it in benevolence and in love, and therefore I receive his love too. Isn't that the case? Sure, I haven't told you anything new. See, this is why the vocation and profession of philosopher is so greatless, because if you're doing the job right, everybody says, but I knew that all along. You're not telling me anything new, right? It is not anything new. We all know that. Now, another step, extremely important, and I've used pictures, and I've used that in a different context. Have you ever seen a feminist receiving Holy Communion? Especially after the changes in rites and rituals and communion in the hand. What is this prescription? You are supposed to extend one hand, the other underneath, allow the priest to place the host in your hand, and then you go away, step to the side, and reverently consume it, make the sign. A feminist comes up, what does she do? Have you seen that? I have. Now imagine here. We have here the lead of the Holy Father. We're going to look at the language of the body. We are called to, instead with a twist of the wrist, we turn the universe upside down. That's Nietzsche, the transvaluation of values, turning everything upside down. Right? That's Heidegger later on. That's Marx beforehand. That's what's happening in our culture. Rather than receiving, we appropriate and say mine. This is why the feminist is willing to call God the creator, but not the Father. Why? Because from the Father you receive life. But the feminist doesn't receive, and by the same token, modern man does not receive. God continues to give, but man appropriates. And we'll see the significance of this in the thought of John Paul II. It will have a formal, metaphysical, and theological significance. Okay? Now, this is the language of a body which, in a sense, gives you a notion, an understanding. You don't have to write a paragraph or an essay to understand the difference. But if we take it a step further and compare the language of the body, what am I doing now? I'm receiving you. And I say, I'm so happy to have you here. Come into my home. Mi casa, su casa. And what am I doing now? Mi casa, su casa. Okay? The exact same gesture is the gesture of giving, isn't it? Isn't it? Okay? However, when I appropriate, how does the gesture continue? And what happens at this point? The gesture continues. And I open my mouth, not in wonder at the world, but just wide enough to consume it. The language of the body helps us now. I appropriate instead of receiving. The gesture continues, not a reciprocity of a thanksgiving, but of consuming the gift, making it mine, and keeping what is given for myself. And when I do that, I embrace myself. Now look at the language of the body. Right? And some of you guys must have been taught already in college. It goes around, you look at a woman's body language. When she's sitting like this lady here in front of me, or you're introduced to somebody, and they say, and turn away and say, yes, okay. There's a closure of oneself, isn't it? To receive, you must open yourself. Okay, so to receive the gift, we must be open. Not so much to the gift. You don't have to be open to the chocolates or to the candy that you're receiving, or the fur coat or the daisy. You have to be open to the giver. You have to open yourself to the giver of the gift. Having taken that step, one more step, and I say, sure, I'm open to you. Thanks for the bottle of scotch. All right, is the drunkard open to the gift? Can you give a gift of alcohol to an alcoholic? Can he be open? Why not? Because when he's in the presence of alcohol, what is he doing? And he's driven. He's no longer in possession of himself. He is driven to appropriate the alcohol. In other words, he does not possess himself. Right? So we're taking a step further. In order to receive, I have to be open. In order to be open, I must be in possession of myself. Why? Because if I'm driven to what is given to me, I'm appropriating it. Why? Because I need it. It's my need, my satisfaction that here becomes operative. Okay, so in order to receive the gift, whether it's the daisy from an admirer or my being from God, I have to open myself, receive the gift of what is given and the giver who is giving because of their goodness, not because of a benefit. And what could be the benefit? Could satisfy me, could make me very happy, could actualize my being. Couldn't it? All of these are possible reasons why I reach out for something. But when I do that for these reasons, whenever I reach out to appropriate. And that means eventually, if we have time, we'll come back to that. It's because I've lost possession of myself and I'm driven by something in my being, in my nature, in my psychology, makeup, and so on. The old word for that, you see, but if I use that word in a secular audience, nobody would listen to me. But if I say we have become addicts to ourselves, we are driven by our own needs, fires, and rages, everybody listens. But were I to say, I am a slave to sin, they would say, here comes another Catholic, right, imposing his opinions on me. But that's exactly what is at stake. The structure of sin is not simply the breaking of the sixth commandment in my neighbor's house, right? The structure of sin begins with the appropriation of what God gives for my satisfaction and not because I accept the giver. Now, so the receiver must possess himself, and then you take the gift and you begin consuming it. Didn't you give me the candy? Don't you want me to eat it? And then you remind little Johnny or little Mary, they're 3 years old, and they say, no, Johnny, what do you say? Thank you. And you're trying to drum them in. They've got to say thank you, and they're 13, 14 years old. Aunt Mary gives them a gift. And say thank you. Thank you. No, a heartfelt thank you. What is a heartfelt thank you? What is a heartfelt gratitude? It's a sincere thank you, isn't it? And what do you do when you say thank you? Here you are, your young mother, little Joey's 3.5, 4 years old. I don't know what age they start doing that. One day comes running in from the yard and says, Mama, here's this little stone for you. Here's a pebble, and here's a worm for you. And Mama, in the end, here am I. Take me. What is he doing? He's giving himself. And you know why he's giving himself? Probably because in his little heart, his mind isn't working you, he loves you, and he's grateful for the gift of life. Gratitude is a sincere gift of self. In our creaturely condition, it is a response to the initiative of God, who gave us the gift of life and the gift of himself, okay? And this gratitude is not merely a spontaneous response, it's a strict obligation. God demands that which belongs to him. He gave you your existence, and that doesn't mean what gifts may mean in our human culture. That I've separated myself, it's yours, and do it what you want. Imagine you gave your friend a gift. It's the self-portrait of Rembrandt. And he says, thank you, fine. The thanks have been given. You come back 2 weeks later, you look in his garage, and what is he doing? He's changing the oil in his car. You come up closer, and you look, and under the pan, there is the self-portrait of Rembrandt. You say, what are you doing? He says, well, you gave it to me as a gift. And then I said, but this is not a piece of candy, which you do what when you receive the gift? To please the giver, you eat it, right? You consume it, and in consuming it, you destroy it. But you're not under no obligation to eat it. You can if you ate it, but if you're a diabetic, you say, sorry, I'm not going to eat it. But can you say this is a Rembrandt, and I can do it as I wish, and I happen to need something not to get the floor of my garage dirty, So I'm going to put it? No. Why? Because now there's something new that appears on the horizon. The nature and the worth of the gift imposes obligations on you. You can't do it with it as you will unless you will to do what you ought to do. Okay? That's another mystery of the gift. The higher the significance, the worth of the gift, the greater is the bond or obligation. Again, you find that in the writings of John Paul II. If I had a longer lecture, I'd give you quotations in each case to something that he says in this. Now I'm trying to sort of bring together the fact that with the gift and everything that we said before, there is the gratitude due to the giver. And what is gratitude? It is the giving of self in a gift. And that's what the young priest saw about the mystery and the paradox of the human contingency in its existence, that our being is given as a gift and we are called to an exchange of the gifts. Right? And because of gratitude. And gratitude is a total gift of self. And because of this, we can formulate now something that John Paul refers to in his Gospel of Life twice, and refers to it a few other times in other contexts, what he calls the law of reciprocity. Have you heard of that? The law of reciprocity? Not too many commentators have focused on that. I see over the last 10 years there's a growing awareness of the role of the gift in John Paul's, but there are certain aspects which still remain unmentioned. One of them is the law of reciprocity and its importance. So I would focus and expand that length, which we're not going to do here, is this moment of self-possession that is central in the understanding of the human person. As person, this is the foundation for the understanding of human dignity, that I am my own. In a certain sense, the feminists are right. I am my own woman. Yes, God has given us our being to receive, and in receiving to take possession of it, of my being. The modern age affirms this. Our culture affirms this basic truth at every step of the way. It starts with Marx. What was the central core of Marx's teaching? What was at stake? It was the question and the answer. The question was, to whom does man belong? And Marx said, under capitalism, man is alienated from himself. He doesn't belong to himself. And therefore, the answer was, he's speaking for humanity, and he called it proletariat, was mine. Man is to reappropriate himself. He's been dispossessed by the capitalist. He must assert himself and take ownership of himself. Central issue in the thought of Marx. Martin Heidegger, that German mystifier, the term, everybody's heard the term authenticity. The thing is to be authentic. Do you know what that means? In German, Eigentlichkeit. And the German term Eigentlichkeit means sich zu eigen machen. To make oneself one's own. And most of our Catholic philosophers who have fallen under the spell of Heidegger look at the word authenticity as if it were simply another term out of the treasury of Catholic and Christian morality. It is the affirmation of ownership against God. Right? So for Heidegger, again, despite himself, he had to say a profound truth. The whole issue for human existence is to take possession of himself. He says many people do not know that they can take possession of himself or find themselves. Many do not know that they have lost themselves. And this is the very beginning of his major work. He got the facts right, but we know that these facts were prophetically and warningly stated by Christ. He who takes possession of his life in order to keep it will lose it. Okay? Heidegger is saying this: to be human is to take possession of one's life and to be master of oneself. But lo and behold, there's this necessary fact which we cannot avoid. We are doomed to lose ourselves and therefore despair, and that's death. The loss of self is death, right? The culture of death. So Martin Heidegger, and more recently, Jacques Derrida, has taken over this notion, but he's stolen the notion of gift now. Right? He speaks of the gift of death, the giving, somehow God gives himself, he gives himself in giving death, but this is the impossibility of life. We're not going to go into detail. We're simply going to refocus on the fact that to be the human person is to make a sincere gift of self. Okay? So self-possession is a metaphysical category. It's a category of being. And how does this involve the category of giving? John Paul says, thanks to this capacity of self-possession, man is capable both of giving himself and receiving the other's gift. Okay? Thanks to this capacity of self-possession, which distinguishes him from animals, not reason, but the capacity to possess oneself. Reason, of course, is there. We can't do without reason. Why is this important? Because without possessing yourself, I can't give myself. And what has the age done? Has recognized the foundations, but has rejected the explanation for this wonderful and mysterious power of being my own woman. Being my own man. When does it make sense to be your own woman? When does it make sense to be your own man? Only when you intend to make a sincere gift of self to the other, to the beloved, neighbor, spouse, God. And all of a sudden, existence and the powers that we have acquire significance. What is the meaning of a power? The only thing that I want in life is to be my own sovereign, to possess myself, but it's doomed to failure and impossibility. And Heidegger calls that death. And that is the culture of death. The culture has decided to keep itself rather than giving itself to God. Okay? I'll skip the personalist principle that John Paul evokes. And very briefly, it's this. Man's dignity consists in the fact that he can take possession of his being and turn it to this end or to that end. This orientation towards an end is not determined by his nature, as it is in the case of animals. And if we happen to turn it in the wrong end, and what is the wrong end? Myself. Then we are called to conversion, to turn around and head in the other direction. And what is the other direction? It is the other, God and neighbor. Okay, so the dignity of the human person consists in that I can take possession of my being and be my own person. Why? So that I can give myself to neighbor, to God, and that is the glory of God. That is man alive, who possesses himself in the gift of self to the beloved. Okay? I want to take one more step. Community. We hear today very frequently of this notion of self-actualization. Okay, I've made myself my end. What is the end of my life? To actualize myself. I may need others, and therefore I'll use others, and that's our culture, but the end of my life is self-actualization. That's the gospel of death. In the Christian tradition, if we understand that man is not simply a rational animal, not simply to actualize himself and to become perfect, but that he is called to make a sincere gift of self to other, to give himself, then we realize that the other plays a fundamental role in our human existence. All right? Now, we have often heard that man is social by nature, have we not? And we accept it as a fact. What explains this? Well, some have said because the human young need parents for education, and then eventually in the city to achieve moral virtue and so on. And that's in fact true, but is not a sufficient enough explanation. And the insufficiency of this comes into focus, I'm not saying it's wrong, but the insufficiency of this comes into focus when we realize the truth, and incredibly important. For me, it was a shocking truth, but it was one that I immediately recognized as true. In the gospel of life, he makes very clear that each person is given his life not only as a gift to himself, But your existence and your existence and your existence are also gifts to me. And I don't have the same choice that I have with candy or alcohol or flowers. I'm bound to accept the gift of neighbor, which is entrusted to me. We know that word, okay? But we're going back to something more fundamental. The neighbor is a gift that I'm obliged to receive. Now, many of us know the symptoms of the culture of death: abortion, euthanasia, child molestation, homosexuality. What is the fundamental essence at the core of the culture of death? John Paul himself tells us what it is. He says it is the refusal to accept the gift of life. And not only of life, but of my brother. And therefore, when we ask, am I my brother's keeper? God's answer is, you bet you are. Because I entrusted him to you, and you to him. And therefore, if I am going to receive God, who gives himself in the gift of my life, I not only have to give back to God what he gave me. Now, eventually we know he is a terrible God because he reaps where he has not sown, right? But we'll leave that aside for the moment. I'm obliged to give myself back to God, but do I really receive God, who gives me my existence, gives himself, when I refuse to receive my neighbor? Right? And James is, can I say that I love God when I do not love my neighbor? We're putting a more explicit theoretical face on this when we say that if I'm going to reciprocate and give my being back to God as a sincere gift, I have to accept the gift of neighbor given to me, and God who gives himself in that gift. And I am to reciprocate to my neighbor by giving a gift of self. So there was the structure of human relations to God, the relationship of the individual to God, necessarily includes the neighbor. Why? Because God happened to give. He could have only created Adam, but what a sad world this would have been, right? With no women, right? Even if there were a lot of guys. What a sad world if man were not given the gift of being able to imitate the Trinity. Right? So the neighbor is given to me, and mortal sin, or sin, consists in this, that man refuses to accept the gift of life, the giver, and the love of the giver. That's John Paul II. And that means that we refuse to accept the gift of God and the gift of neighbor. So when somebody says, save that baby, and I happen to have a Coke or Scotch in one hand and a Baby Ruth or the New York Financial Page in the other hand, what do I have to do in order to receive that baby? The only bomb that the modern age is afraid is to hear the sound of that Coke hitting the ground. Right? This is where we exercise the strength that is needed to receive the neighbor, by dropping that which we are consuming. And what is the most important thing that we're holding on to? Right? And if somebody says, save that baby, here's a gift from God to you, what do I have to do? I have to let go of myself. How much of myself? I have to be able to let go of my life. And that is the meaning of death for the Christian. We have a different perspective on death. That's why death for us is life. Why? Because when we open ourselves in receiving, in order to give, we can now use another metaphor for life and say life includes respiration, doesn't it? If somebody stops breathing, they're dead. And what does respiration involve? It involves being inspired. And God breathed life into Adam. But how many of us, and this is modern man, he's inspired, and he refuses to expire. But what is expiration? It's not the running out of your driver's license or your parking ticket. He expired. He died. We have to be willing to expire. And this is the rhythm of life as a person, not the biological respiration of taking in breath and letting out. Not the excitement and the fervor of a life in pursuit of satisfaction, of benefits, and I'm going to shock you, even of salvation. There's only one reason we are to accept and reciprocate the gift, for the sake of the other. And again, this is one of these texts that I would read to you if I didn't see your eyes glazing over. Okay, we are called to give ourselves. For a number of years, I'd quote our Lord's words about losing your life. He who tries to save his life will lose it. He who loses it, why would you want to lose your life? And the answer was to gain it. And I asked, was the Lord giving a short course in business, talking about long-term and short-term profits? Is that what he was doing? And I say, remember your Catholics, and I'm going to ask you again, why lose your life? What does the Lord say? For my sake. He's telling us. We can't approach the notion of the mutual exchange of gifts from the perspective of a market economy, where I take from you, and according to the logic of fair exchange, this is the words of John Paul II, I exchange what is equal. I mean, certain logic of justice. Why do I do that? For my benefit. But I owe you. And that's the letter of the law. I exchange something. But it's always for the benefit. You can have a free market. You can have a market economy, but you can have radical self-centeredness. The Pope says in Centesimus Animus, prior to the logic of fair exchange, there's something that is due to man because he is man. The weak, the old, the comatose, the poor have no marketable needs. And yet they've been given to us, they belong to us. More importantly, we belong to them. And if I belong to you and don't give myself to you, I am due to you, am I not? That's justice. I am bound in justice to make a gift of myself to you because I belong to you. Why do I belong to you? God gave me to you. And therefore you can say of me, you are mine, as I am yours. But the giving of what is due to the other, in Centesimus Annus, the Pope explicitly says moral life consists in this, that man gives the due response to God for the many initiatives God has undertaken that towards man out of love. And this response is love, and love is the total gift of self. In this way, justice and love come together, do they not? We belong to the other, we are bound to give ourselves. To give ourselves, we must take possession of ourselves, we must reclaim ourselves. And to take possession of ourselves, St. Paul calls it a dying to oneself. We can say it in technical philosophical categories. I must deny myself. Deny what? Deny all desire of satisfaction, all desire of profit, all desire of happiness, and I'm going to shock you, even of salvation. Why? Because only one thing is necessary, right? But we take a step further with John Paul II when he speaks of the Church of the Eucharist. He constantly speaks of the Eucharist as a gift of Christ to us. Now, and let me close this by taking that final step. Self-actualization as human persons is not the end or goal of our life. We are to give ourselves. We cannot give ourselves unless we give what has been given to us. Not simply my yacht, not my bank account, not my reputation, but my neighbor. And how do we do that? We must give each other mutually to ourselves. All right? The primary form of this is marriage. And in marriage, we can become one. Not simply by turning to each other in an I-thou relationship and aiming and saying, I'm going to enter you and you enter into me. Let us mystically contemplate each other. That's fine. But you can't do that if you simply orient yourself towards the other. You will never become one flesh if you exclusively turn yourself towards the other. Mike may remember in Christendom I used to say there can't be anything between us unless there's something above us. In other words, only when I turn to my spouse and eventually to my neighbor and say, what is it that you are living for? And if she says, I only live for you, then I say, look, I can't help you. And if she says, I'm only living for myself, I say, look, I can't help you. I can use you in exchange, but I can't help you. But if she says, I'm living for God, then I can say, beloved, how can I share in your gift of self to God? Can I become one with your act? And she can become one with my act. And whether it's the spouse or whether it's an employee, if I ask my employees, what is it that you want a son or Mr. Smith in life? And he says to eat, drink, and make merry. I say, well, look, I can't help you. I'll pay you for what you're doing, but I can't participate or share in your act of living. But if he says, I want to provide for my wife and children, and I want to see him in heaven, then I can say, brother, how can I be one with you? What is the original meaning of the word community? It sounds pretty easy. Communio, right? Come one, union. Is that what it is? No, the original meaning of the word is munus. And munus means gift. And communus is the sharing of the gift. That's what community is. The sharing of the gift. Man has forgotten the original communion, the original gift, and that's why John Paul II goes always to the beginning, as it was in the beginning. In the beginning, God gave us the world as a gift to be shared with the other. And he gave Eve to Adam, and Adam to Eve. He gave himself, and they are to share the gift primarily of God, secondarily of the world. And only then do we have community. Only then can we return to God what we owe him. When we become one in thanksgiving, giving back to God the gift he gave to us. And we Catholics know, when do we become one? I'm not telling you the answers. When do we become one? In the body of Christ. Communion, when we share the gift of Christ. And Christ's gift is primarily a gift of himself to the Father. And only then do we become fully human and persons. Only then is self-actualization realized. But that's not our end. Our end is to give to God what belongs to him, and that means me and everything else that he's given me. I and my household serve the Lord. So I'll end there. I see your eyes are glazed. And if there are questions, there's a lot more questions that can be developed.